This day in 1876 in the Cecil wig, the Armstrong Company in Port Deposit, I'm sure you've heard about it. It was run by three brothers. Thomas was the oldest, James and William were the other two brothers. They originally came to Port Deposit poor, and they were apprenticing when they first began under John D. Marchbank, also known as Marchbank and Marchbank if you look him up in old periodicals. He was operating a foundry here. Well, when the Armstrong brothers' apprenticeship was over in 1854, they started their own business in the old foundry on Port Road. We know it now as Center Street or Jacob Tome Memorial Highway. And it was in the hollow, and it was in a frame building that was 60 foot by 30 foot. It was originally built in 1840. They only had one apprentice their first year, so they were working with a skeleton crew. In 1856, Armstrong began to manufacture tinware, and they employed one man in the small building opposite the factory. Business grew, as one would hope, and in 1858, they leased a lot on Main Street from Edwin Wilmer. That's where they would put their office and their wares room, like a storefront kind of thing. By 1860, the Armstrong Foundry employed about 50 men, and year by year from there, as business increased, they made additions to their original building. To save on having lots of downtime and needing to raise a building and construct anew, they would build over the former building. How ingenious is that? This was a much shorter amount of time lost, since the original, now inner building could be removed, as workers still functioned in areas unaffected by the demo of the original building. In total, at their peak in Port Deposit, the foundry had 8 buildings. Traveling up from Main Street, if you go up Port Road or Jacob Tome Memorial Highway, let's lay it out for you. The footprint was, the first building that you passed was the finishing house. It stood 4 stories tall and was about 30 foot by 60 foot. Next was the machine shop. That was 3.5 stories tall. It was a frame building with a footprint of 36 feet by 45 feet, and it had a basement. The engine shop was next with the smith shop, and it had a footprint of 60 feet by 19 feet before you got to the casting house. And that was another frame building that stood with a footprint of 30 foot by 50 foot, and it was 1.5 stories tall. Now, this next building is referred to as the main building. It had 2 furnaces, so you can imagine how hot things were in there, and if fires were a possibility. So foresight in fire prevention dictated the foundation be of granite and 54 inches tall. Under this building and the molding floor was the stream that's still there. It was known as Factory Run. Well, a solid arch of granite was carved out so as to manage the stream's powerful overflow, like during, storms and spring freshets and whatnot. There were over 1,000 perch of granite that were consumed to construct this culvert. That was just a feat in and of itself. Other buildings encountered were, as you continued up the hill, were the 10 foot by 20 foot core oven and the open flask shed that was unenclosed, hence the word open, but it had an impressive footprint of 85 by 90 feet. There was one building across the street that contained only plow castings. It was 36 by 36 and it was 2 stories. That was its only function. Now, as you can imagine and as you can remember, as you go up the hill, it's very narrow. The landscape, you have the hollow, and then you have hills directly behind you as you travel up the road. So the buildings were all pretty much in a row, and they extended for a long distance up to Main Street, or down to Main Street. So speaking of Main Street, let's go back down the hill. We finished going up the entire footprint. Now let's go back down to Main Street to the building that they leased for their offices. That was enlarged in 1870 by the Armstrongs to a final footprint of 38 by 50, and it had 2 floors. It too was a frame building. It was a stick building. The concrete block white building now sits in its place. It ultimately succumbed to fire, which is why the original is no longer there. So there you have it. There's the sprawling and impressive footprint of the Armstrong Foundry in Port Deposit. By 1871, the building had grown so much and it was hard to keep up with supply and demand that they actually expanded to a second location in Baltimore at 60 Light Street. Now, the Armstrong Foundry left Port Deposit and they ultimately went to Perryville, which you may know. You'll probably find ovens and stoves with Perryville and Baltimore on it, more so than you will Port Deposit. They left for Perryville in 1888, and actually that building stood at the north end of Front Street and was demolished so recently as 2001. Well, thank you for your time.